It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I've always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
I've mentioned several times in this series that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood debuted on February 19th of 1968, but we haven't taken time as a group to think through what that period of time was like in the life of our country, what the 60s were like. I can tell you that on February 19th, 1968, my mother had a 5-week-old baby boy, her firstborn and only son, quite possibly the cutest kid that's ever been born. I mean, my mom would definitely say the cutest kid that was born in 1968. So that's kind of where I was and my family was in 1968. But there was a lot going on in the 60s. Some of you have memories of it. Some of you have studied it or heard about it. To get us into the context of what the 60s were like, here's some information about the 60s. In 1969, a new house cost $15,500. Right? A new car costs $3,270. Brand new car, drive it off the lot. But then, of course, the average income per year was $8,540. A gallon of gas was 35 cents. The Beatles' first song was released in 1962. Anybody know what it was? It was Love Me Do. Right? And if you're singing it in your head, you're old, all right? Love Me Do. It's catchy, as most of their songs were. Also in 1962, Spider-Man first appeared in a comic book. First time we saw Spider-Man. 1964, the Ford Mustang was first introduced. Right? That was a very good year, wasn't it? 1969, astronauts landed on the moon. So all of these fascinating events of history took place in the 60s. But if you remember the 60s, if you know about the 60s, you've read about the 60s, you know that the 60s were not just Spider-Man and the Beatles, were they? There was a lot of conflict in the 60s. There was a lot of tension. There were a lot of things about our world and about our country that seemed to be coming unraveled. People were facing off against each other. It was a traumatic decade. It was a tense decade. It was a decade of conflict. Everything from wars, right? Early 60s, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, most notably throughout all of the 60s and extending to either decade on either side was the Vietnam War, which our country erupted in protest and disagreements, and people were on different sides, and there was political division, there was division about what the military should be doing. Even some of you have very strong opinions about it right now. You're already thinking about your side right now. The 60s had all of this conflict, all of this division within our world that spilled, as I said, into the 70s. May 1970 was the Kent State Massacre. National Guard opened fire on protesters at Kent State. This was the culture of the 60s and leading into the 70s. There's a lot of tragedy in our country. in the 60s. President Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Senator Robert Kennedy is assassinated in 1968. Although Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, it's the 60s when the civil rights movement really started gaining a lot of momentum, thanks to leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There's a Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's a Voting Rights Act of 1965. There were marches and protests. There's the march from Selma to Montgomery, Bloody Sunday, Edmund Pettus Bridge. That's the 60s. All of that conflict, all of that tension, all of that us versus them, sides, pointing fingers, that's the 60s. Dr. King gives his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and tragically is assassinated in 1968. There's a lot that happened in the 60s. It's like 10 lifetimes. You start thinking of everything that happened in the 60s. It's like 10 lifetimes were squeezed into one decade. And people had strong opinions. People were not indifferent in the 60s. People were on their side. They were entrenched in their beliefs, in their upbringing, in the way that they saw other people, in the way that they saw other groups of people. And now we have the perspective of time. Right? We can look back. That's been a long time ago. From 2021, we can look back at the 60s, and we know that there were some people who were very confident in their position, and they were very wrong. Right? Matter of fact, we look at some of the positions that people held in the 60s, and we think, how would anybody see things that way? Why would anybody take that side? Why would anybody see another human being that way? In the midst of all of this conflict, in the midst of all of this tension, in the midst of injustice that was taking place throughout the 60s, riots and protests that were taking place throughout the 60s, there was a man in a cardigan sweater who shows up on TV February 19th, 1968. And in that environment, encourages us towards kindness, encourages us towards gentleness, encourages us towards goodness. There was a voice, not the only voice, but there was a voice through the medium of a children's television show that said, we don't have to fight each other. We don't have to hate each other. Remarkable for its time. Mr. Rogers invited a man by the name of Francois Clemens, who was a black man, to have a recurring role on the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood program. Francois Clemens was a professional opera singer, and if you ever see him appear on Mr. Rogers, he often sings a song while he is there. Mr. Rogers had heard him sing at a church event, fell in love with his voice, got to know him, loved him, and said, Mr. Clemens, I want you to have a recurring role on my show, which was a huge opportunity for a person of color in 1968. But the role that Mr. Rogers wanted Francois Clemens to play was a police officer. He wanted to have a recurring role as Officer Clemens, and this became a little bit of a tension for Francois Clemens because his upbringing and his experience with police had not been a positive one. His perspective on law enforcement, because of his experiences, was not a positive one, but Fred Rogers is persistent. And so he finally convinced him to come on his show. And throughout the years of Fred Rogers' neighborhood, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, you would see Officer Clemens. But there was this one moment in 1969 that is one of the most memorable moments of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and one of the most culturally shifting moments of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. You remember, Dr. King has been assassinated. There's riots and protests. Segregation, desegregation is in this battle. It was illegal to segregate, and yet that was still happening. One place it was most obvious was in public pools. White Americans did not want people of color swimming in the same swimming pool as them in the 1960s. And this had erupted into quite a bit of conflict in various places around our country. So there was this moment in 1969 that Fred Rogers created this scene with Officer Clemens. And maybe you've seen it before. Officer Clemens walks in, and Fred is in his front yard, his TV front yard, with a kiddie pool, and he's putting water in the kiddie pool, and he's rolled up his pants and taken his shoes and socks off, and he's put his feet in the kiddie pool. And when Officer Clemens walks up, he says, "Why don't you cool your feet in the pool with me?" Which is not that striking to us today. It was unbelievably striking in 1969. Officer Clemens responded, "But I don't have a towel." And Fred Rogers said, "That's fine, you can use my towel." And they sat, and they talked, and they soaked their feet in a swimming pool. In the early 90s, when obviously both of them were a little bit older, they reenacted that same scene. See, there was this voice. There was this voice that said, in the midst of all of conflict and tension and us versus them, and I don't like you, and you're different from me, there was this one voice with a cardigan sweater. You know what? We're all the same. We're all humans. We're all capable of feeling love and giving love. We're capable of seeing each other as equal and valuable, created in the image of God. As we think about this theme of how to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, we can't rush through that discussion without admitting sometimes that causes us to love neighbors who aren't like us in every way. That stretches us to build relationships with, to care about, to love people who look different than I look, who have a different background than I have, who view politics differently than I view them, who engage in social issues differently than I do because of their background. To love your neighbor as yourself isn't simply to love the people who are just like you. That wasn't the command. Jesus did not say, love your neighbor who thinks exactly the way you think as you love yourself. Love your neighbor who looks exactly the way you look as you love yourself. Jesus said, just love your neighbor as you love yourself. Barna Research Group released a survey not long ago. And in the survey, they discovered that most Americans, 65 to 70%, most Americans, when asked about their friend group, who are the people that you typically make friends with? Who is in your friend group? 65 to 70% of the respondents said it was people that was just like them when it came to areas of ethnicity, income, life stage, political views, beliefs. 65 to 70% of Americans said, now that I think about it, I'm kind of only friends with people just like me. What was striking about the survey, what was alarming about the survey, is that when the person answering the question was an evangelical Christian, it went to 90%. Around 90% in the areas of beliefs, ethnicity, and political views, around 90% of evangelicals said, I'm only friends with people who are just like me in their beliefs, their ethnicity, and their political views. Evangelicals. Which is bizarre when you consider that we follow a Messiah who loved all kinds of neighbors when he was here. He crossed all kinds of cultural boundaries and racial barriers because he just loved his neighbor. Whereas 2,000 years later, many who call themselves evangelicals have isolated themselves from anyone who doesn't believe exactly what they believe or view the world exactly the way they view it or look exactly the way they look or has an opinion different from theirs. Many, perhaps 90% of evangelicals have decided, I'm only going to be neighbors with people like me. The next time you read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, pick one. I would encourage you to notice how often Jesus gets the side eye from people because he's talking to the wrong person. Like, how many times do his disciples or the religious leaders or the crowd, how many times do people give him the side eye because he's talking to somebody he shouldn't be talking to? Well, that person's not with us. That person's not like us. The culturally other than, the racially other than, the poor, the disabled. Jesus is just moving towards them. This was the life of Jesus. He just kept moving towards people. And it didn't matter what the person was or who the person was. Jesus kept moving towards them. Familiar story for some of us. Jesus and his disciples are traveling through Samaria, which was the other side of town. You don't go there. You don't like them. You're not friends with them. The disciples go into town. Jesus has a conversation in the middle of the day with a Samaritan woman. And to observant Jews, that was the wrong person to talk to. Culturally, racially, that was the wrong person to talk to. The Samaritans were a part of the northern kingdom of Israel, which was attacked and decimated by the Assyrians. And some of the Jewish people who lived in Samaria in the northern kingdom were carried away into captivity by the Assyrians, but some of them stayed in that same region, and then the Assyrians repopulated that region with their own people. Well, because they were living so closely, they began to marry each other. They began to intermarry, and their children, in the minds of Jewish people of the time, their children became a mixed race of people. Not only that, they supplemented the Bible according to the Jewish people of the time. And they picked the first 5 books, but they rejected all of the prophets and everything that came after that. They kind of tweaked some of the language so that they became the center of the story, and their part of Israel became the center of the story. They adopted in some ways some of the pagan worship and idol worship of the Assyrians that they had begun to marry. So culturally, racially, religiously, politically, they were other than us. They were them. We are us. We don't talk to them. We don't go through their part of town. And Jesus stops and has a conversation with a woman, which in and of itself would have been culturally unusual for him to talk to a woman, especially to talk to a woman at a well in the middle of the day, because the whole reason she's there in the middle of the day is she has something to hide. She doesn't want to come when the rest of the women come. She has something to hide. She has baggage. She has a story. She has a background. No one would talk to her, and yet Jesus does. Jesus moves towards someone who is not like them. This is what happens when the disciples come back. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" But obviously, they were all thinking it. And that's why the narrator puts it in the story. They were all thinking the same thing. They were all giving Jesus the side eye. What are you doing? Why are you talking to her? Let's go. We don't hang out in this part of town. We don't talk to those people. But the nature of the Gospels is often the very people that the disciples wanted to push away were the people that Jesus wanted to get close to. The people that the disciples didn't have time for were the people that Jesus had all the time in the world for. They wanted to pass by the disabled and the poor, and Jesus always stopped. You remember the story of the kids coming to Jesus? And the disciples' response was, "No, we don't have time, we don't have time." And Jesus said, "Let them come. Such is the kingdom of heaven." The disciples are always pushing people away for their own reasons. Jesus is always drawing people close. When you read the story of Jesus, you find out that Jesus wanted to be around the people that others didn't want to be around. He wanted to be close to the people that others wanted to get away from. He wanted to be around the people that others didn't want to be around. So a woman, a Samaritan, an ethnically other, the poor, the disabled, children. Jesus wanted to be around people that other people didn't want to be around. Because he understood that to love your neighbor meant to love all of your neighbors. Whoever is in front of you. And Jesus just kept moving towards them. Just kept moving towards them. It prompted the religious leaders at one point to complain because Jesus would have dinner with tax collectors and sinners, which is somewhat of a euphemism that just meant the worst people we know. Jesus keeps having conversations with all the people we don't like, the worst people we could possibly think of. Which, by the way, whoever that group is to you, you wouldn't call them tax collectors and sinners. But whoever the worst people are to you, the people you most want to avoid, the people you most disagree with, most dislike, the worst people doing the most damage to our culture, the worst people in the world, Jesus would have dinner with them too. Jesus would move towards them too. Jesus would love them too. Which we can turn it around even. Because not only did Jesus move towards the worst people in the world, the tax collectors, Jesus moved towards the Pharisees too. I mean, he not only had dinner with the tax collectors and sinners, he had dinner with the religious leaders too. And let's be honest, the religious leaders are the bad guys in most of our stories in the New Testament. They're the guys we don't like. We find all sorts of reasons to dislike the Pharisees and the religious leaders, but let's be honest, Jesus didn't just move one way when it came to loving people. Jesus turned around and moved this way too. See, sometimes we create the bad guys in our mind. Sometimes we create the really, really terrible people in our mind. But you can't read the Gospels without realizing Jesus just kept going towards those people in all directions. He kept moving closer to those people in all directions. See, I think sometimes if we aren't careful, we will dislike the Pharisees so much, or whatever group you want to put in there. We'll dislike the Pharisees so much that we'll forget that the Pharisee is our neighbor too. Like anybody you create to be the enemy, anybody that you create in your mind to be the worst person, Jesus is going towards them. Jesus' love is moving towards them. Jesus' grace is tracking them down. Here's the story. Here's one of the stories when he goes to have dinner with the Pharisees. Luke chapter 7. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Which the irony of it all is, so was the Pharisee. We form these groups and people that we dislike, and God would never, and God's against, and we don't realize we're in a group too. Like the irony of this story, and sometimes the irony of our spiritual experiences, is we have one sinful, undeserving person complaining about another sinful, undeserving person. Like whenever you say those people, whenever you group people, you forget you're people too. You're no more deserving of the grace and love of God than anyone else. Jesus comes to a Pharisee's house to move towards them, and they're mad that he's moving towards somebody else that they consider as a worse sinner than they are. And here's Jesus. Interesting thing is, Jesus is in the middle of both. Jesus is in the middle of this group that's complaining about that group and that group that's complaining about this group. If you and I take the command to love our neighbor as ourselves seriously and we start living it out, we will often find ourselves in the middle. We'll often find ourselves trying to love this person over here, but also trying to love this person over here. And that person doesn't like that person doesn't like that person. But God's called me to be neighbor to both of them. This group, this side doesn't like this group and this side. And I'm in the middle because God's called me to love. God's called me to love my neighbor as I love myself. So what's the line? Like, with all the drama happening in our world right now, what's the line? Where do we not have to neighbor? Where can we stop loving? Jesus answers that in a way in Matthew chapter 5. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemies,' but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good." In other words, he doesn't play favorites. Like, his love's going out to all people. "And sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?" Where's the line? Which direction do we not neighbor in? Which direction do we not love towards? According to Jesus, the line is this: we're to love everyone from those who love us to those who are our enemies. So anything in between here and there, any person that falls in between loving you, like you, similar to you, and your enemy, you're supposed to be their neighbor. You're supposed to love them. So the person who loves you, you love them. And the person who likes you a little bit, you love them. And the person who tolerates you, you love them and you're their neighbor. And the person who dislikes you, you love them and you're their neighbor. And the person who hates you, you love them and you're their neighbor. And the person that's your enemy, you love them and you're their neighbor. There's no boundary to the love that God has called us to exhibit to our neighbor. And sometimes we get stuck. Like, we get stuck loving the people who are like us. We get stuck loving the people who agree with us. We get stuck loving the people who've had the same life experience we've had, so of course they view all the issues the way we do. They grew up in the same socioeconomic environment we did, so of course they have all the same views as we do. And yet Jesus was always moving down the line and moving closer to people who were not like you. God has called you to love your neighbor. Scott Sauls is a pastor in Tennessee. He wrote a book several years ago called Befriend. It's a collection, he describes it, of 20 essays of individuals who decided to love someone that was not at all like them. And here's how he sets up the book in chapter 1. He says, "You will notice a common thread in each account of real friendship. Real friendship happens when we move toward the people we are most tempted to avoid. These are the people who are best equipped to challenge our perspective, push our buttons, and require us to put on love." It's not challenging to love people who are like us. But Jesus asked almost, have you really demonstrated love when you do that? If you only greet your own people, if you only connect to people who are just like you, how is that allowing the transformation of Jesus in your life to shine through? It's not. It just makes you like everybody else who only likes people who are like them. It only views politics the way you view politics, or only views social issues the way you view social issues, or only views religion the way you view religion. Jesus said that's not the work of the Spirit in your life when you love people who are just like you. The work of the Spirit, that the development of Jesus in your life is when you love somebody that you find difficult to love. When you love somebody who doesn't agree with you all the time. When you love somebody who maybe can get you to see this world through a new lens and through a different perspective. Love your neighbor. All of your neighbors as you love yourself. Jesus and Mr. Rogers had this wonderful way of just removing the boundaries. Like the only boundary that they saw was love. The only guideline, the only restriction was love. And again, if you think of the 60s, I know that we look at our time now and there's conflict and there's tension and there's racial struggles and there's political sides and there's posturing and there's groups and there's pointing. But we can look back at the 60s and there was somebody in the middle of that happening who was willing to say, we can love, we can be gentle, we can be kind. There is goodness in the midst even of a world that's in conflict. That should be us. As the people who are living out the kingdom of God, that should be us. In 2021, full of conflict and struggles and hurts and loss and injustices, we should be the ones saying, yes, you can put your feet in my pool. Yes, I want to know you. Yes, I want to understand your hurts and your perspective. I want to love you with the love that Jesus has given me. Here's what we often miss. As we're running to our groups, which is where we are as a society, we kind of line up with our groups and we just agree with anything that our group says and we stay in our groups. But what we forget when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to God's love for us, is that we were the outsiders at one time. If you've come to know Jesus, it's only because you were an outsider and Jesus went to you. You were not like God. You were not like Him in that He is holy and you were not. He is perfect and you were sinful. You weren't of the same race as God in that sense. You did not know His goodness. You did not know His grace. You ran from Him. And Jesus crossed boundaries to come to you. And now if you are His follower, He has given you that command. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. The neighbor that looks like you and the neighbor that's completely different from you. Love all of them the way you love yourself. God, we ask that You would challenge our hearts. Not unlike the 60s. We live in a time of great conflict and great struggles. We live in a time when groups of people are experiencing huge injustices. We have this nostalgic view of the past as if there were good old days at some point. We have this nostalgic desire within us that wants to believe things were perfect at one time. They weren't. I mean, just a simple look at history. We have been fighting and mistreating and taking advantage of and dismissing. For we are human and we are sinful. Right up to this day. And what will solve it is not a political leader. It's not a new law, although those have their places. What will solve it is enough Jesus followers who just decide, I'm going to love my neighbor the way I love myself. And the only boundary for that love is going to be love itself. I'm just going to keep loving people. And I'm going to make it a priority to love people who aren't like me, because I need to learn from them. I need to listen to them. God, help us not get trapped in a small little bubble of only befriending, of only loving people who reflect our own perspective. But help us be like Jesus, who kept moving towards people who weren't the same. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.